Hello, and welcome to my presentation on tort liability, negligence, and strict liability. This presentation will explore the three primary categories of tort law and their relevance to educational settings. I'll also discuss duty of care and how schools can reduce tort liability risk. My name is VictoriaAdams, and I'm from the University of West Alabama's Instructional Leadership course 571 on school law. What is tort? Tort is a civil wrong. This means someone is harmed by another person or entity, but not through a crime necessarily, but in a way that the law still recognizes as wrongful. For example, slipping on a wet floor at a store with no warning sign, or having your reputation damaged by false information. How is it different from criminal law? Well, tort law is part of civil law. The main goal is to compensate the injured party. Criminal law is about punishing crimes against society, and penalties may include jail time or fines paid to the state. In a tort case, no one goes to jail. Instead, the person found responsible, known as the defendant, must pay damages, money, or be ordered to stop doing something, which is called an injunction. The burden of proof in tort cases is called the preponderance of the evidence, which means the plaintiff, the one who's suing, must show it's more likely than not that the defendant is responsible. This is less strict than in criminal law, where guilt must be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. So let's look at types of tort law. There are intentional torts, negligence, which is the most common, and strict liability. An intentional tort involves deliberate acts that cause harm, like battery or defamation, whereas negligence involves a failure to act with reasonable care, which is especially relevant in school settings where supervision and safety are of utmost importance. Strict liability can occur even when no one can be found at fault, but harm still results. This is typically from very dangerous activities or defective products. Each of these areas has its own legal standards and consequences, but they all share a common goal, and that is to ensure that individuals and institutions act responsibly and are held accountable even when harm occurs. In schools, understanding these categories helps administrators and educators reduce legal exposure and protect student well-being. We're going to look more in depth at intentional torts. We'll look at the definition and a few types. Intentional torts occur when an individual purposely commits an act that causes harm to another person. This is unlike negligence, which may be an accident or oversight. Intentional torts reflect deliberate behavior. In school environments, these can manifest in a few ways. For instance, if a teacher grabs a student aggressively, it may be considered battery. If a student is falsely accused and punished without cause, it could be defamation, or even false imprisonment if they are detained inappropriately. Even verbal attacks or spreading false information about a student or another individual could result in intentional infliction of emotional distress. Educators and administrators must remain aware of how their actions and words can be interpreted. Creating a respectful and professional atmosphere helps prevent these kinds of legal issues. Schools should also make sure that staff are trained to handle conflict resolution appropriately and that documentation of incidents is done carefully in case legal questions arise later. Intentional torts lead to significant legal consequences for school districts and employees. So, prevention through policy, training, and expectations is key. Let's look at intentional torts and some more specific examples. Let's start with a teacher locking a student in a room. This would be considered false imprisonment, as a student being locked away in a room for an unreasonable amount of time would definitely violate a situation where a person is intentionally confined in a fixed space for an unreasonable time period. Publicly shaming a student or gossip or false accusations could fall under defamation. So let's use an example of suppose a principal publicly announces that a student was caught cheating without evidence, and it's later revealed that that student is actually innocent. This can be a case of defamation, especially if it causes reputational harm. And suppose that a student missed out on a scholarship opportunity or an award as a result. It's important that schools avoid disclosing this type of information without having the source verified. Intentional infliction of emotional distress. This is a very unique situation in which a teacher would use shame repeatedly. So here's an example. A teacher repeatedly humiliates a student about their appearance and hygiene in front of the class. If this conduct continues and it causes psychological damage, this could meet the legal criteria for the intentional infliction of emotional distress. Battery. If a teacher uses physical force, like the example on the screen, a teacher using physical force to stop, or the example earlier about a teacher using physical force to grab a student, if they do this or strike a student during a moment of discipline, it may rise to the level of battery. Now, of course, that would depend on the force used and the context of the situation. The courts have recognized the right to discipline within reason, but not to physically harm students. These examples just continue to emphasize the importance of professional boundaries and the need for staff training. Schools should maintain clear policies on appropriate disciplinary practices and emphasize respectful communication to reduce intentional tort risk. Let's look at negligence. Negligence is the most frequently encountered tort in educational settings. It involves a failure to exercise appropriate care, leading to an injury or harm to a student or staff member. According to Strader, 4 key elements must be established for successful negligence. So that on the screen there's 5, but cause and fact and proximate causation fall under causation. And we'll review that in just a moment. Duty of care. Schools have a legal obligation to protect students from foreseeable harm. This includes providing a safe environment, proper supervision, and responding to emergencies appropriately. Breach of duty occurs when a school or staff member fails to meet expected standards. For example, if a teacher leaves a classroom unsupervised and a student is injured, that could be considered a breach. Causation. So there's cause and fact and proximate cause. There must be a clear link between the breach of duty and the injury. For instance, if a student trips over a mop left in the hallway and breaks an arm, the custodial staff have been warned about the mop being a hazard, causation can be established. Both cause and fact and proximate causation, being that there was a foreseeable danger there. And then looking at damages. The plaintiff must prove that the breach caused a tangible injury or loss. Without damages, there is no legal remedy, even if the breach occurred. So schools have to be vigilant in preventing negligence through adequate training, supervision, and maintenance. Awareness of these elements helps school leaders assess and mitigate potential liabilities. Let's examine negligence in schools a little more in depth. So negligence in schools is often unintentional but can have serious consequences. Let's walk through each of these examples and see how they relate to the 5 elements of negligence. So unsupervised students. So leaving students unsupervised during recess or dismissal. One of the most common sources of school liability is leaving students unsupervised. If a teacher leaves a classroom or fails to monitor students during recess and a fight breaks out or a student is injured, the school may be found negligent for breaching its duty of care. Failure to act on bullying. When school personnel ignore or inadequately respond to reports of bullying, especially if the student has made multiple reports, the situation can escalate and result in emotional or physical harm. This breach of duty has been the basis of several lawsuits, as courts often find such harm being foreseeable. Failure to maintain school facilities, such as broken stairs or faulty playground equipment. Schools have a responsibility to maintain a safe environment. If a janitor or administrator is made aware of broken stairs or a leaking ceiling and fails to fix it or post warnings, they could be held liable if someone is injured. Hiring staff without proper background checks, despite warning signs. Negligent hiring. If a school hires or retains a staff member despite known misconduct or red flags in their background, they may be liable for any harm that results from that individual's actions. Courts have often viewed this as a failure to act reasonably during the hiring process. And there's also an instance of medical negligence. Schools must respond appropriately to students' known medical needs. If a student has asthma and the staff fail to administer an inhaler during an attack, despite having a care plan in place, it can result in serious harm and legal liability. All of these examples point to the need for schools to implement proactive safety policies, staff training, and timely intervention to protect students and avoid negligent claims. Now we'll look at strict liability. Strict liability is unique among the three categories of torts because it doesn't require proving negligence or intent. In other words, even if a school or staff member acted responsibly, they could be held liable if the activity or item that caused harm was inherently dangerous or defective. According to Strader, strict liability typically applies to situations involving hazardous materials, dangerous activities, or products that are defective. In these cases, if harm occurs, the defendant is liable simply because they were responsible for the activity or provided the product that caused the harm. In a school, this can happen very easily. Let's look at an example. Suppose a school purchases science lab goggles that appear to be safe but have a manufacturing defect. If a student is injured while using them, even if the teacher followed all the safety protocols, the school could still be held liable under strict liability because the product was defective. The key factor is that the harm was linked to the product or the activity itself, not necessarily any negligence on the part of the staff. Strict liability is important in schools because we often use specialized or potentially dangerous equipment, from lab tools to playground gear. Understanding this area of law helps administrators be more cautious in product selection. So let's examine a few examples of strict liability. This slide focuses on how strict liability shows up in schools, often related to the materials and equipment we use. So while staff may not be acting negligently, injuries caused by faulty or inherently dangerous items can still result in legal consequences under strict liability. Let's walk through a few examples. Let's look at the defective playground equipment causing an injury. So suppose a swing set has a manufacturing defect in its chain, a child falls and is injured. Even though the school did routine checks, the injury is still the school's responsibility under strict liability because the equipment itself was unsafe. We could go back to the faulty science lab safety gear example from the previous slide. It's not that we didn't follow protocol or that the teacher was negligent, it was that the equipment itself was bad. Malfunctioning sports equipment. So if a helmet is cracked and a football player sustains a concussion that can be considered worse because of the helmet being cracked, regardless of the coaching staff knowledge, the school may still be liable due to the inherent risk associated with defective gear. And then think about classroom furniture. Injuries caused by old, unstable desks or collapsing bookshelves may qualify under strict liability, especially if the school was unaware of the danger beforehand. And then technology hazards. With modern tools like 3D printers and CTE classrooms utilizing tools in ag or culinary equipment, there's potential for burns or electrical injuries or cuts constantly. If a defective part causes harm, the school can be held accountable, regardless of user behavior. These examples really emphasize the importance of rigorous product selection, safety inspections, and proper documentation, even when staff isn't in question. A reminder that administrators should also maintain strong relationships with vendors and warranty providers to reduce risk. Let's analyze duty of care. Let's get a definition and look at how it's applied in schools. Duty of care is one of the most fundamental legal responsibilities in education. It means that teachers, administrators, and staff are obligated to act reasonably and responsibly to prevent harm to students. Failing to uphold this duty through inaction or carelessness can lead to liability for a school or individual employees. We'll look at some things a little more closely. Let's look at safe premises. School buildings, playgrounds, classrooms, and equipment must be regularly inspected and maintained. For example, loose floor tiles, broken stair railings, or faulty electrical outlets should be promptly repaired to prevent accidents. Under supervision, students should never be left alone or unsupervised, whether in a classroom, hallway, or during recess. Even those short lapses in time can lead to injuries or altercations, and schools can be found negligent for failing to monitor students appropriately. Under policies and procedures, schools are expected to develop and enforce policies covering student discipline, like in a student handbook, attendance, emergency drills, and healthcare plans. Having these in place ensure all staff understand them helps to limit liability and provide a consistent standard of care. And then training. Staff must be trained on how to respond to emergencies such as fires, severe weather, intruders, or medical incidents. Without this training, even well-intentioned employees may respond incorrectly in a crisis, resulting in harm. And then legal compliance. Schools must comply with all state and federal laws, such as reporting suspected abuse, accommodating students with disabilities, and following due process and disciplinary actions. Ignoring these responsibilities violates duty of care and can result in both tort claims and civil rights lawsuits. So ultimately, the duty of care is about being proactive rather than reactive. So if schools are foreseeing issues, staying on top of them, and monitoring things effectively, they will not have to respond to things reactively. When schools embed safety and responsibility into their daily operations, they not only protect students, but also reduce their risk of exposure and legal risk. So we're going to go back to managing duty of care, and I'm going to emphasize this point again. Managing the duty of care requires schools to be proactive. Again, taking the initiative and not being reactive. You also have to be organized and thorough in how you operate every day. It's not enough to react after an incident. School leaders must put systems in place to reduce the chances of harm ever occurring in the first place. Let's look at this in those 5 areas we just discussed. Safe premises. Safety begins with the physical environment. So schools should routinely inspect playgrounds, hallways, stairwells, bathrooms, classrooms. Identify and then fix any issues. Something as small as a missing floor tile or an exposed wire can result in serious injuries and liability. Moving on to supervision. Supervision must be deliberate and well planned. Teachers should be assigned to monitor all areas where students gather. So that can be classrooms, cafeterias, restrooms, and hallways. Schools should have clear protocols for lunch duty, recess, arrival and dismissal times, and even transitions. Policy awareness. It's not enough to have policies on paper. Staff must know and understand and follow those policies as well. This includes protocols for handling student fights, administering medication, reporting bullying, or managing visitors on campus. Regular policy reviews and training sessions make sure that everything's consistent and reduce the likelihood of violations. There should be ongoing training. Staff should be trained in CPR, how to use an AED, how to respond to allergic reactions, and how to report suspected abuse. Emergency preparedness drills, fire, weather, lockdown, these should all be conducted regularly, and schools should update procedures as new risks evolve. And then legal compliance. Schools must stay current with laws related to mandatory reporting, student privacy, disability accommodations, and equal access. Legal compliance is not just a matter of ethics. It's a legal requirement. For example, failing to follow a 504 plan or an IEP can result in serious legal action under federal law. Effectively managing the duty of care shows that a school is committed to protecting students. When systems are strong, risk is minimized, and that leads to better learning and safer environments for everyone. Reducing tort liability. So to minimize exposure to tort liability, schools must take proactive preventative steps. These are not just legal safeguards, they're also best practices for creating a safe and structured learning environment. Again, going back to routine safety audits, schools should regularly assess classrooms, hallways, stairwells, athletic facilities. This includes checking fire extinguishers, emergency exits, playground equipment, and lab safety tools. Repairs or replacements should be documented and scheduled promptly. Supervision plans. Having a formal plan in place for student supervision is essential. Schools should develop duty rosters for areas like the lunchroom, restrooms, car lines, and even school buses. And staff should know exactly when and where they're assigned to be and what they're looking for. Lapses in supervision are the leading cause of tort claims. Policy implementation. Policies mean little if they don't know, if people don't know what they're supposed to do. Schools should host regular professional development on procedures for discipline, emergency response, and accommodations for students with health and or behavioral needs. Communication between leadership and staff is going to be key to that consistent enforcement. Documentation. Proper record keeping can protect the school in legal disputes. If a student is injured, staff must document what happened, what actions were taken, and who was notified. This includes medical issues, disciplinary incidents, or suspected abuse cases. Timely and accurate documentation helps show the school acted responsibly. And then a culture of reporting. Finally, students and staff must feel empowered to report concerns without fear of retaliation. This includes reporting unsafe conditions, like physically in the building, harassment, bullying, or potential violence, anonymous tip lines, peer support systems, and open door policies with the administrator all help foster a protective environment. If we implement these strategies, schools can significantly reduce the likelihood of tort liability while also making campuses safer, more transparent, and more responsive. Some recommendations to reduce tort liability at my school. So, in addition to the structural and procedural improvements already discussed, a critical part of reducing tort liability is ensuring staff understand that their actions or lack thereof can have serious consequences. Here are the expanded recommendations with this in mind. Our school recently adopted the Raptor alert system for drills and evacuation protocol. I would like for the school to proceed with purchasing the Raptor Hall Pass system. Our layout is multiple buildings, and so this would strengthen our ability to track student movement across those multiple buildings. Right now, students sometimes travel unsupervised, creating a gap in our duty of care. And the Hall Pass system would log when these students leave, how long they've been out, and they would provide accountability and data. Supervision gaps. Our school is very old in some buildings and newer in others, and there's a lot of little nooks and crannies. And we continue to see high-risk areas during breaks, especially around restrooms and outdoor spaces, be can run the risk of not being supervised properly. Reassigning or increasing coverage during these unstructured periods is essential to maintaining safety and reducing liability. I also believe anonymous reporting would be great, but I would like to add that reporting needs to have a disclaimer attached to it. So, and those are great tools. They encourage students to share safety concerns, but I also believe that we must include a disclaimer stating when these reports are checked, how and when they can expect follow up, and that would limit the continuous liability of a school system. School staff would also need to be trained on how to follow up on these reports. And then scenario-based crisis training. My husband is the assistant EMA director, and I'm really impressed with the drills that they perform in the county for the local law enforcement and first responders in general, and with our electric cooperatives. I believe that a more real-life scenario-based drill would be great for schools. I realize we don't need to do this with students necessarily, but with staff. This would go beyond just basic lockdown and fire procedures, and teachers and staff would engage in real-life simulation to help prepare us for a medical emergency, student violence, or an intruder. And I think that this would minimize hesitation and help us to know what weaknesses we have. I also believe policy revision with actual crisis team members would be great. Many policies are created without input from the individuals who have to implement them. So I think if you include the crisis response team in this process, that would ensure procedures are more realistic and actionable. And then staff awareness of legal consequences. Perhaps most importantly, this is the keystone here. Staff must know that negligence, failure to report, and failure to supervise can result in personal and institutional liability. A teacher who leaves a room unattended, or ignores bullying, or fails to report a suspected case of abuse or neglect, or to act during a medical emergency could be legally responsible, even if they didn't mean harm. And including this message and training makes the legal stakes real and reinforces accountability. My apologies. And I believe when everyone from the administrator to the custodial staff understands their role in protecting students and the legal consequences of falling short, the school will become a safer place and more compliant. And the focus will be on learning, which is what it should be all along. And then here are my references. And then I just want to say thank you for taking the time to pay attention. I know this has been a long presentation, but it's been very helpful to understand tort and its application in schools.